I'm actually going to start a little bit differently with this one. I want to make sure I had slides so we're ready to roll. But I know for this one, when we're talking about writing promotion and tenure narratives, it's really important to actually look more, I would argue, at some models and some different ways to kind of think through this. So I'm actually going to show like some live examples, and I've got some slides to follow up. But what I want to do first is just to hear from anybody that's willing to kind of participate. What are things that they're concerned about, or what are sort of the issues at hand? Because I know from tenure and promotion narratives and preparation with this is that they're pretty loaded, right? Like you're making a case about work that you're doing. A lot of times they are reflective in nature, where you're looking back and you're using past verbs and all that kind of stuff. And you have to kind of craft them in a certain way. So I have lots of samples and all this stuff that I'm going to share. But I would love to just hear what people are kind of concerned about or thinking about or wondering how to balance before I throw some stuff up at us. So anybody you can type it in the chat because I realize for some people they're like, I'd rather type that out, or you could say it out loud, however you guys want to do it.
I have something.
Yeah.
It's regarding teaching. So I'm in Houston in nutrition, and oftentimes I would teach to an empty class here in Houston that was zoomed in to Denton. And there were always tech issues. I couldn't see the students. I saw the back of their heads due to the cameras. There was no engagement. I couldn't see when people raised their hands. So obviously my teaching evaluation for that particular
Oh yeah.
class that year were awful,
Yep.
awful, rightfully so.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I mitigate that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
How do
we're
I
definitely.
write that in but still remain positive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really good a challenge that a lot of us face. Let me hear from a couple other people because I'm going to bucket them for us and talk about how to solve. But yeah, that's a real one. A lot of faculty are facing that now. So anybody else have one that they want to share? And then we'll talk about how to solve that. We're gonna do some problem solving today. Let's see. Um, yep. All right.
I'll share one
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
based
Yeah, go ahead.
on what I know that someone else said.
Hmm.
What if my department's criteria
Hmm.
don't give me a whole lot in terms of how they define teaching effectiveness? They
Oh,
just say, you should teach effectively.
hmm. Yeah.
What do I do with that?
Yeah. Okay. I love this. These are all teaching. We're gonna, like I said, bucket them. Okay. Anybody else have one, teaching or otherwise?
So I have one, and it's a
Yeah.
little bit more general. And it's kind of more of my perspective on serving on the faculty review committee or the my peer review committee. What happens when you get narratives written and they make a lot of really loose or general statements without evidence to back them up?
Yeah. Yep.
How do you rate that?
Yeah. No, yeah. So this is more like on the evaluation side.
Hmm.
Yep.
Which I
Okay.
will say, being on that side makes it easier now that you're going up for promotion and tenure because you know how to write things and then what to support. But it
Mhm.
just, in my experience, I've seen some narratives that were written and it was like, no, I don't think that that's like, there were some things that were not necessarily true or were exaggerated or the person's role in
Mhm.
a project or something was exaggerated.
Oh yeah. Yeah, always the padding.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, these are all good. Yeah. These are all yeah, these are all things that actually happen for sure. And let me throw out a couple of other ones and then we're going to look at like how do you solve them? How do you write these? And also everything that I'm going to talk about today, I have tons of great samples and I'm going to put them in a little folder and give them to Nancy and she get just a Google folder where everybody can look at them. So you can look at them to your heart's content and you can say, okay, I really like that. I want to use that. Because one of the things we do, kind of a fun side note, is that for some universities, we run their tenure and promotion preparation. Like we run it all. Like we say, okay, let's talk about how to write those narratives, and we teach them as writing exercises and stuff like that. And there are things that I know that have held true. So let's take the example of thinking about teaching effectiveness, right? Like it's very tough to define what is effective teaching. And so one of the things that you can do is you can define effective teaching in your discipline, in your own way. One of the ways that I know I have successfully done it, which is kind of different, depending on your discipline, but I've done this where in writing studies, I will pull, say, position statements from my organization and say, this is what my organization, which is my disciplinary home, says is good teaching. Because in absence of having somebody else tell you what effective teachingness is, it's better, yay, Nancy, to do the defining yourself. So that's one thing that you can do that. And one spot that I think people don't do, I would assume that maybe you have to have a teaching philosophy as part of a submitted package. And people are sort of like, yeah, maybe if you have a teaching philosophy, that sometimes can be a spot to do that. Because what you can do, if we think about verbs for a minute, and I promise we're going to show samples, but I like to chat before I show samples, just so everybody's kind of like listening, we're all getting the same things. So if we talk about verbs, usually when we have tenure and promotion narratives, they're past, right? They're reflecting on the time period under evaluation. So like past tense verbs, you're looking at like whatever your time period is, the last 5 years, the last 6, the last 7, whatever it is. If we talk about teaching philosophies are usually ongoing, right? This is how I teach. So it's like an ongoing thing that you do. So sometimes universities have like limits and how big and how sizes of things. So one spot where I often will encourage people to do is in your teaching philosophy to define good teaching there and say, my discipline says that good teaching is XYZ. Here are some linked, policy statements. You could check it out. Here's how I do those practices in the classroom. So for a teaching philosophy, a lot of times people will say generic things like, I'm a student-centered teacher or something like that. But we all know that student-centered teaching is very different across our disciplines. And sometimes that's not, student-centered teaching in some ways sounds outdated to things like flipped classroom and like other phrases like that. So I would encourage you to, for one thing that you could do for everybody is to just look and see what are some best practices in my discipline defined anywhere in a scholarly journal, in an organization, anywhere, because that's a really good starting point because then you have very carefully researched evidence to say, this is what good teaching is according to my discipline. This is what best practices are. This is how I'm engaging in those. And failing that, because some disciplines don't have best practices outlined, but if they don't, another place that you could go is you could pull back and pick some like well-known teaching support things that are popular. So for example, a lot of people really like the work of James Lang and they like his small teaching, or they like his work on, cheating lessons and how to discourage students from cheating and things like that. You could pick one of those sort of like big name teaching players and work talking about your philosophy in that way. And you might think, it's my personal philosophy. I don't want to necessarily like talk about somebody else. But the nice thing about that is it provides some research grounding, and especially if a criteria for effective teaching are not defined, it does give you something to stand on. Okay, so these are some things that you can do. Let me say one thing about the bad evaluations, because then we're going to do lots of fun like show and tell where I just show you how all this stuff plays out. But we have all had bad semesters. Probably everybody here has had either a class or just a bad semester period. So there's a couple ways that I kind of look at that when I look at buckets of evaluations. I definitely tend to pay more attention to patterns in things than just sort of the off comment that students will, not whatever, for whatever reason, they're mad at you, they don't like you, whatever. Now, in an online classroom where we have or a hybrid classroom, we have this very like unsatisfying situation with like backs of student heads, and you personally know like this was probably not great. One of the best things that you can do is sort of acknowledge the teaching fail. Like say, this was a class where we did XYZ. These were some of the circumstances, and you're reporting it in a very like reporter objective stance. Like these are some things that happened in there. These are some things that I would do differently next time. Or this is why some of these evaluations are coming back the way they are. And I've done that too. So, for example, I had a class, I taught a first year writing class where I didn't know this at the time, but my class was full of 24 students who had already failed the class once. The cap's 24. I mean, I'll get like 5 or 6 repeaters in a class now and then. I've never had a class of 24 people repeating the class. So these are already people, like the whole class is repeaters. These are already people that have kind of negative perceptions about the class. I'm up against some things, but providing context in those reflective statements was one way where I could say, this was a student population in here. These are students that the highest percentage that these students earned prior to getting to me was a 61% or something like that. Like I was able to say that without being defensive, because of course that's a problem, right? You don't want to be defensive about things. So yeah, let me show you a couple things, and we're going to look at some real life examples. Let me get screen share going on here. Nancy, I think you gave me sharing access. You did. Yay. Okay. All right. So one place that I store this stuff, because I run all our tenure and promotion efforts at University of Findlay, and I actually have a Canvas course where I'm able to like do some show and tell. And so with permission, I thought that was a good thing to show all of you. So you could kind of see like what are real ways people are sort of attempting to do some of these things. So one of the things that we have faculty do when we're thinking about writing our narratives is you have to, at least for us, and this is probably true for you, you have to write a narrative about, your scholarship, you have to write a narrative about your teaching, and you have to write about service. You may have other things. We technically have 5 categories because we have a professional development category, and then we also have like an external service category. So we have many of them. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful when we're thinking about writing these narratives is I would try to treat them as very separate genres. A lot of times the advice is like make them look very standardized going in there, but they have different goals. So that's something that maybe is the first piece of advice to take away before we start looking at this is when you're writing these narratives, the teaching narrative doesn't have the same goal as the scholarship narrative. So even though the goal might be to convince my review committees that I'm wonderful, that's true, right? You want to pass, you want to get, a good evaluation. They don't have the same kinds of things in place because they're 2 different or 3 different parts of our academic work. So, for example, in our teaching, when I teach reflective statements, one of the things that I will do is I will have faculty, and I'll open a couple of these different ones where you can see them. I will have faculty talk through things about their teaching that are happening using specific examples, and I'll use those to illustrate what is going on in the classroom at large. So, for example, to get this one up here, and I'll make it big so everybody can see that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Jake Burmeister, he is a psychology um, professor, but he has written statements. I'll make them bigger, and everybody can get these samples as well. So I'll make sure that I share them with you. But one of the things that we do with teaching is sometimes we tend to go right to the numbers or to the comments on student evaluations, but I like a little bit of a setup on a teaching narrative because I would think of it, yes, you do need to talk about that, maybe your ratings were more positive or you have like the numerical data to back yourself up. But I would also try to trace some of those kind of mathematical things back to how you're thinking about teaching now that you're reflecting on it. So let me say that again. Once you have taught, you already know things that went wrong in the last classroom, things that maybe were terrible in year 1 but got better in year 2. Like you have a lot of information in there that you can capture. You can talk about where some of your growth or your success happened in general before you get into like a quick like here's a bunch of comments, here's a bunch of numbers. So one of the things I like about this one is this one really talks about owing success, owing some teaching success to integrating some scholarship and research into teaching. That's just what he's doing. That doesn't mean that's what you're doing, but you probably know the answer. Like if I would ask you, what's making your teaching better? It could be, oh, I went to a conference and I learned this new technique, or it could be, I now only assign 4 papers instead of 5. My students were really overwhelmed with 5. Or it could be that every student has a chance to rewrite that lab report before they get a grade, or I drop the lowest grade. So that's one thing I would really think about before you enter in writing the teaching statement. This is not all of it. You're just looking at the very tippy top, but really thinking about like what is making my teaching better will give you a better shot at reflecting on the teaching. And that assumes that your teaching you feel is getting better, but also your evaluations are reflecting that it's getting better. So if you consistently are having negative evaluations, even though you feel like you're doing everything you can, I will talk about how to approach something like that. There definitely is a way to do it. But in general, teaching like life, it's up and down. Some semesters are better, some classes are better. So I like a nice frame where you can kind of say like, I know I have gotten better over the time period. Here's some ways that I know that. And he's even referencing like different artifacts and things like that already at the beginning, which of course you can also do. Let me drop down to some other things in here. Our another thing that I would recommend doing in your reflective statement, this is something that I've encouraged at pretty much all the universities that I'm working with, but I would also remind yourself, what are the criteria for teaching? Like what kinds of things do you have to put in the dossier as a whole? Like what teaching artifacts would go in there? Or if there's a rubric being used or something like that, I always like some good categories. Like that's just some good structural pieces. So in this case, like one of the things that's on our annual eval or our end of semester evaluations for students, but it's also on our tenure and promotion evaluation is just, do you present subject matter clearly in a course? So, again, if we think about like all the different areas that you might have to talk about in your narrative, I would think of these as kind of like little mini essays. So in this case, this one's about clear presentation. So this is a way that I'm doing it. This is, a reference to how it's playing out, for example, in his health psychology course. So he's talking about like how he tries to teach, these bigger ideas in here. And then he talks about some actual things that he's doing. He's using comments from student evaluations. And where I'm at and where many of the other institutions that I work with, we have numerical data. We have student evaluation data and all that that's provided in a separate area of reflected or the dossier itself. It wouldn't be in the reflective statement, but you could. You could pull some actual numbers and talk about each of the categories and say, okay, these are some areas where I'm doing really, really well. So let's say there's 5 areas for evaluation on teaching. You might say, okay, well, in area 1, if we look at that across all my courses, I'm doing really, really well there. Let me stop for a second and see what questions people might have about that. Any questions so far? Make sense so far? Just some practicalities. Yeah.
I have a question. Oh,
Yeah, great. Christine, let's see. Sorry, everybody's really small because I made my screen big.
oh, that's okay. I was just wondering if these headings that are bold are those aligned with criteria in the um, tenure and promotion?
They are for us. These are our headings, but with other institutions, the headings are all different. So yeah, I like
Mm.
having the subheadings within the narrative. If unless you're giving guidance not to do that, they help because let's think about it from a reviewer standpoint, right? Like one of the things that they have to do is they have to read a dossier and they have to say, does this person meet the criteria established in our faculty manual or in our policies? Do they or not? So one of the things that I will tell my own faculty when I train, I'll say, well, wait a minute, you have to show clear presentation for subject matter. You don't want to write the narrative that's like paragraph after paragraph, and they have to kind of like dig in there to try to find it. So I do like a bolded heading just to give them the signpost, here's the spot to look for it. And like
Mm.
in his case, he's pulling out individual comments about that. Now, this probably is true for you as well, but one thing I've seen across teaching categories, and I don't know, 50 universities, however many times we've done this workshop, but one thing that I know is that a lot of times the categories sound kind of similar. So, like one of ours says clear presentation of subject matter, but then there's another one about like effective use of class time. Those two things sound really, really similar. And my university doesn't really define them. So here's another thing, kind of a little tip about this. I would, of course, if you can see samples of people that have gone before, and of course, if there's ways to ask to be like, what's the difference between these two categories? Of course, try to find that out. But if not, you might have to draw some distinctions yourself. So, and that's what we did in this case. So, like clear presentation of subject matter and course, what we decided that is that's the category that talks about the course as a whole. Like overall, through the whole course, was the material clear? Did we get to the end? Whereas use of class time is more about like how valuable were those in-class sessions or those online class sessions. So yeah, but to answer your question, I do like some bold subheadings in there that go with the categories, and then really trying to pull from like student evaluations, or if you want to pull numbers to say I've received no less than an average of 4 on this category. That's how I might organize it a little bit. I know there was another question. Somebody else want to ask?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So there's a real discrepancy for me between the evaluations that I have from students
Hmm.
versus the performance review evaluation that I have for
Yeah.
teaching. And I'm wondering how to talk about it, how to
Hmm.
deal with it, if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Oh, I love it. Yes, this is so common. So, for example, you have somebody come in to observe your class and they see a class and then the students evaluate the class. That's, when we're talking about a performance review, that's what you're talking about, correct?
No, I've actually never had a faculty come and observe my class. This is the materials that I've submitted for my third year review
Oh,
and
I
for
got you.
this year. No one's ever watched me teach.
Yeah,
It's more just, I guess, how I'm writing about it that they're evaluating it.
I see.
Anyway, yeah.
No, I got it. I got it now. Okay, yes. All right. So one way that I would think about that discrepancy when you're writing a reflective statement, a tenure and promotion narrative, um, everybody knows there's a discrepancy. So one thing I always tell people, this is just general good advice for these narratives, is hiding is never a good idea, or just sort of like pretending it's not there, usually never a good idea. So one thing that I would do is I would notice the discrepancy but reframe it in a very positive manner. So it could be that you could say, in my performance review, this was noted about teaching, A, B, and C. Let's say those are positive and the students were negative, or, vice versa. You could talk about the things that were called out, and if they're negative, you can reframe them using what the students are actually experiencing. Right. So let's say performance review is negative. They're like, well, you should be doing a better job. But student evaluations have some good comments. You can, again, like I said, use those student evaluation comments to reframe that and say, well, this was in the performance review. However, if you actually go to look at the student evaluations, this is what's happening. And you could flip that. So let's say the performance review was really positive, but then the students are kind of either like, I always call these like flat evaluations, where I kind of get them and I just sort of get like average marks. They're not bad, but they're not great. Or you might get, one or two negative people. You can also do the flipping that way. You can say, while there were a few dissatisfied students on this particular area, my performance review noted this strength in teaching, this strength in teaching, this strength in teaching. And I would also add something else. So for negative student evaluations, I have a great resource. I'm going to share it I'll give it to Nancy. We'll put it out there so everybody can have it. But there's some really good ways to respond about negative teaching evaluations. So in this case, I never dismiss the teaching evaluations like, oh, there was just one bad one, or this was, just one student having a hard day or whatever. I will sometimes acknowledge, like, say, I realize in this particular class, I had these 3 unhappy students that did not like, the workload, or they thought the grading was unfair. My performance review suggests I have strong teaching. These are great. However, I did take the students' feedback into account, and these are some changes that I made in the course going forward. So, like, there's good ways to kind of like wrap that up where you're saying teaching, you're continually learning, as we all are, right? Other stuff about teaching that people want to ask, like those kinds of things, like how do you frame it? Okay, keep them coming. You can unmute, drop them in. All right. So yeah, so for teaching, always, always use stuff from evaluations when you can, any kind of data that you have. But I would also, here's another like fun thing about teaching narratives for tenure and promotion is this is an opportunity for the review committee to get to know you as a teacher. And we all teach differently. We all are teaching, like some of us have large lectures, others of us have really, smaller seminars, or some people are online or hybrid or whatever. So if you can, I think it's really important to talk about, what are some things about teaching that you like, but then use the evidence to back yourself up. So for example, so here's one, this is an example specific, which helps, is Jake's talking about his abnormal psych class, and he says, okay, these are assignments that I make that have, I actually test them on information. So basically like memorization, all that kind of stuff, but also an analytical skill. What is their ability to detect, these latent themes, and that kind of stuff where it's really showing what's going on in the class can be really useful. So here he's talking even about like, how do I grade something like that? Because for many of us, especially for teaching, when we're talking to narratives, talking about grading is tough because we have to make a judgment call. Is this the right grade to give students or not? And especially if you teach a killer class that students don't like. So for example, one of my English classes, it's the most failed class on campus. Not because of me, it just is. It's just our, it's a writing class. Nobody likes it. We have a high failure rate. And then we got like statistics or something behind us. But if you have something like that, you can also counteract what I would argue is sort of like negative themes that are emerging from your evaluations by kind of reframing a lot of this stuff positively. So you love doing, what you do, that energy kind of comes through in the narrative. You can still pull specific pieces of evidence to show what you're doing, but you can also reframe, because reframing is really big in these narratives. You can also reframe like, students may be complaining about specific things as signs of growth. So let me say that again and tell you how that might happen. For example, in one of my teaching evaluations, actually, this is a frequent comment that I get. Well, they'll say, she didn't discuss all the readings in class. So you know how like all the readings are on the syllabus, and I did not discuss them in class. I teach a gender studies, like an intro to gender studies. It's like a gen ed class. I get burned on that one all the time. And so, how I would reframe that, or how I have reframed that, is I have said that in my syllabus, I have a policy that notes that all the readings are fair game for class discussions. So that doesn't say I'm going to use them, but I do have it in the syllabus. So that's another thing for some of you that are kind of looking ahead, like, how can I fix some teaching problems before I have to write about this? Sometimes just getting it in the syllabus is a way that you can communicate to your review committee to say, I've really thought carefully about this. And some days we don't get to all the readings, or some days we only use one reading, but students get really, really interested in it. And it's a deep dive and we don't get to the others. So there's ways to kind of do that. But then I can go back to my syllabus and say, this was communicated with students ahead of time that all readings are fair game. There are many class periods we hit them all, but now and then we don't. So you might think about things like that, like where, if you get comments on student evaluations, how might you reframe that in the narrative? Other questions about that kind of stuff? Always think of a reframe. And here's another thing. Depending on where you are on the AI side of things, please do not load any of your stuff in AI. That is not what I'm saying at all. But what you can do if you want to, and I've had faculty do this before, is say what the problem is with no specifics. You could say, I'm a professor. This is something that I'm worried about. I have student evaluations that are upset that I assign too many lab reports or whatever it is. What are some ways that I could reframe why I'm doing what I'm doing? You can get some language that at least can help you kind of think through. You can also think about all the possibilities why students might say why that, what they said. So here's another thing. I have found from looking at a lot of tech, because I review a lot of these narratives before they go through. And sometimes faculty get really defensive in the teaching narrative because, we feel like everyone's against us. Our students are mad. The administration might be mad. And it's tough. It's really tough out there. So one of the things that I try to do when I'm, talking about narratives or I'm reviewing them is I'll have faculty, I'll say, definitely go through and kind of watch tone as much as you can, kind of reframe. It's a problem I'm still working on. it's okay to still have the problem. Because I bet all of us in here could name, like, here's one thing that always is kind of a problem for me. So, like, one thing that I know is not great for me is that I write really long comments on student papers, which you think they would love, but they actually don't because they say it takes too long to read the comments. And by the time they get to the bottom of it, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. What they want me to do is write like a quick little comment bubble in Canvas and say something. So, one thing you could do in your teaching narrative as well is really kind of hone in on what are like two problems or two patterns in my teaching that are going to show up in my evaluation. They might show up in my performance review. I need to talk about what I'm doing about it. Because, by and large, most review committees, if you show some evidence or some like reflection and thought about like how you're going to solve the problem, much better than to sort of either pretend it doesn't exist or get really defensive where you're like, well, those students, they just weren't prepared for my class because that doesn't do what your narrative needs to do. Your narrative needs to prove that you've met the criteria for teaching. So the only route there is to think about it from like a positive kind of reframe, like this is exactly what's supposed to be happening. So here's another thing that I've done that's been really helpful doing teaching narratives is I've really thought about it from the point of view of from a student. And I've actually had that work pretty well for me. My last review that I went through where I had to, because I had students mad at me about an assortment of issues in one of my classes. So what I did is I actually wrote in my narrative, and feel free to do this as well, is I actually did it I looked at this class that all my students were complaining about. It's an upper level writing class. It's a lot of work. They don't like it. They just don't like it. There's a lot of reasons. And I also give them a lot of work. I push them pretty hard. So one of the things that I did, and I wrote about it in the narrative, is I said, these were some of the comments that I was getting about my assignments. Students are complaining. They say they're too much work. All these things are happening. So one of the things that I did is I actually went and did all the assignments myself. And I talked about it in the narrative. And I said, I actually did these assignments. And here's where I have now changed two of the assignments because I realize why students are frustrated. I now know because I'm really trying to get in those students' shoes. The other thing that I have done that's been really helpful, and depending on when you have to submit one of these narratives, you could totally do this. I now do a little evaluation sheet for midterm, a little evaluation sheet, a little midterm check-in, but it doesn't look like an evaluation sheet. And I'm going to send it to everybody so you guys can actually, if you want to use it, you can in any class you have. But I don't have a regular evaluation type questions. I have questions like this. Number one, how are you doing in the class? Just generally, how are you feeling about it? How are you doing in it? Two, is there anything I can do to make this class better for you? And then three, is there anything that you could do to make this class better for you? So like those kinds of questions, such great insight. I put those in as pieces of evidence. I mean, depending on what you're allowed to put in as evidence, but I was able to put in, we have a spot where you can put in additional evaluations. So I put in some representative classes using those. And so what it did is it kind of saved me from negative evaluations on some things because students, if I just said, is there anything you could be doing to help yourself? Students would admit to me all the time, I haven't read anything. I didn't log into Canvas for 3 weeks because I was at a baseball tournament, like whatever. But all those things are great, right? Like then you have a nice way to kind of wrap it up with a nice bow in your narrative and really reflect back on the class. So, and I do think because I've actually had somebody do this strategy that in my institution who was kind of on the line, like teaching was not great, really not great, and not great kind of late in the game, like in year 5. And this is a strategy that this faculty member, we'd been working with them for a couple of years, and we had them try it, and it was a way that they could say, you know what, you'll see my evaluations are not good in years 1 through 4. And it was because they kept doing the same test bank and the same thing that the students didn't like. But as soon as they got it together, even though they only had 1 semester of evidence where the numbers went up a little bit, that's evidence. So it's late, but it's still there. So it's not too late to save yourself usually. Other stuff about teaching that people might want to ask. So I know you're not looking at a lot of samples. I'm going to give them all to you because I think to me the conversation is more than one size fits all for this kind of thing. But anything
Could
else
you
for
give us those questions again that you
Yes,
asked?
I will give you the midterm check-in, but I'll give you 3 questions right now because I only give them 3. So one is how are you doing in the class? That's it. And I tell them, like when I give it to them, so if I'm in a face-to-face class, I print it out like old school on a half a sheet of paper. And I'll tell them, I'm like, you don't have to write your name on it. Be totally anonymous. I don't care. Throw it by the door on the way out. One is, how are you doing in the class? And I will tell them, tell me anything you want. It could be like, you think you're getting an A. It could be like, I'm okay. It could be, I'm bored, or I dread coming here every night, 9 a.m., or whatever it is they want to tell me. So, or like one, this is funny, just this last semester, somebody said, you have noticed I haven't been participating in the class. My ex-boyfriend sits 2 seats away from me. I had no idea. No idea. So, like, just you never know what you'll get. But how are you doing in the class? Number two is there anything I can do to help you do better in the class? So, is there anything I can do to help you do better in the class? And I tell them, I'm like, tell me anything you want to suggest to me. Anything you want. I'll see if I can make it happen. So, is there anything I can do to help you, do better in the class? And then number three, is there anything that you could do to help yourself do better in the class? So, and that's the one about you. And they will tell on themselves. So, I mean, well, rarely. I did have one person that says something like, you need to do the work, you're the teacher. So, yeah, you might get that, but it's really telling. And the other thing that's really great about these is that I find I get really good ideas about how to talk about teaching, because now you know what the students are having a problem with, that our regular evaluations, they're never going to measure. They're never going to measure the stuff on there. So, yeah. And I will tell the students, I'll say, hey, this is for me to make my class better. I will, I'm going to use this feedback to, make sure I improve as a teacher. So, I mean, I kind of make it clear to them that, there's a chance I'm going to use it in my dossier or my yearly evaluation, but they usually don't care. And I don't have them put their name on it. Online, I use a discussion board and I do it anonymous. So in Canvas, you can make a discussion board anonymous. I will do it that way. And then they all can see each other's answers, which is a little bit of a bummer because sometimes you get people just echoing what another person said. But you can check that box that says, no, you can't see what someone else wrote until you post yourself. So I usually turn that on. But then I also found that sometimes students don't want to be the first one. So I've experimented both ways. So I will say it's truly anonymous. I really don't know. And please say specific to you what the issue is. Yeah. All right. So we talked about a ton of teaching things that can go in that teaching narrative, but let me see if there are any other teaching things that people want to ask about. And like I said, I have samples of all the stuff that you can look at, but I know we have other narratives we got to talk about, like scholarship and publication. So anything else for teaching that's like a burning question that people want to ask about? Okay, awesome. Let's switch to scholarship. So, scholarship, here's the thing with scholarship, like teaching sometimes is not in our hands, right? It is to some extent, but then the students get to say something about us. Scholarship is a lot on us, right? So, one of the things that's kind of a challenge with scholarship is that it kind of people kind of worry about it when they write about it in a tenure and promotion narrative as sort of a language that's kind of like personal failure. I didn't publish enough, or I didn't present enough, or I'm doing the wrong things, or, whatever the issue is for scholarship. So some of the things that you can do to really help yourself, and actually, oops, there we go. Let me pop this open for a second. One thing that I think really helps is to spend some time defining your area before you have people looking at a reflective statement, right? So here's what I mean by that. I have seen many, many tenure and promotion narratives about a scholarship, and they tend to take a couple forms. If people are publishing enough and they meet the number and the requirements for scholarship to be tenured or to get promoted or whatever, they tend to talk about the different artifacts, and it's kind of clear cut. Yes, they have, 5 peer-reviewed articles or 2 books, or the numbers are there. There's also the group that is kind of defensive. Like they don't have the numbers and they're doing like some either like padding, like, oh, this conference presentation is totally equivalent to a peer-reviewed article. Like I'll see that. kind of stuff all the time. But I think the ones that are most interesting to the review committee, and I'm always thinking about them as a reader, right? You want them to like you, you want them to like your writing. So, one thing that I think is kind of cool is if you explain to them before you dive into, oh, I published, this peer-reviewed article and it has this impact factor of whatever the number is, they need to know what you even do. Like, we're all in different areas. And of course, in a department, that doesn't mean like if your department is reviewing your stuff that, somebody in poetry totally knows what's going on in literature, or somebody in writing knows what's going on in literature. So, one thing that I think is really worth it is just a quick paragraph that just talks about what's your research area or what's your scholarship area. So, like in this case, he just spent some time talking about, like, hey, this is stuff about chronic mental illness. Like, these are things that I look at. And then he even talks about, in this case, he is doing research in a subfield of clinical health psychology. So, here's another thing, almost all of us are working in some kind of like more narrow subfield that we're working in. My area is in faculty writing studies. I study how faculty write. My bigger area is writing studies. And then the bigger umbrella on top of that is probably English, like the Department of English. But if you can get narrow and explain what are you doing? So here, this is about like he's saying, okay, this is the subfield I work in. This is what my work within this field does. This is my focus of the type of things that I'm doing. He even talks about like in the future, here's how I'm going to build on some of those research projects or on this area in the future. And he's got evidence and things like that. But before we even get to anything else, he's giving us just kind of that quick overview of, hey, this is what it means. Another thing that you can do if you're in an area where it's not clear. So, for example, I have a guy in pharmacy, right? Pharmacy, no, he's in like a nuclear medicine. So he's in nuclear medicine. In their field, white papers, super big deal. They're a really big deal. Like that is like a cool publication. It's, people read them all the time. They use all the stuff. But like in my area in writing studies, a white paper wouldn't be the same as like writing a book or something like that. So another technique that you can do in your scholarship narrative is just take a minute or two to just describe or remind what scholarship in your field looks like. So here would be some ways to think about this. A lot of disciplinary organizations have that already. There's policies or there's statements where they'll say something like, effective research in nursing must have patient needs first, and whatever the criteria are. There are a lot of those kinds of like, I don't, for lack of a better word, like policies and things that you can draw on. Because what you could do, you're bringing in, right, another source that says you're amazing. So that's what we're trying to do here, right? So for me, one of the things that I could do there is in writing studies, somebody has put out a policy that says this is what is considered scholarship in writing or in writing studies. And in my field, some administrative work is considered scholarly. So I was able to pull the policy and say, hey, we don't have accreditation in my field, but we have this. This is the big organization. Here's the policy. And then that way, when I was talking about different things I was doing, somebody that can't get their brain around, like, well, wait a minute, that's administration, that's not scholarship. Now I have something that says, yes, it is. So of course, this depends on like what level review you're going and how big your particular department is. So, if people in your department are pretty much well tuned to what you're doing, maybe it's not, you don't have to get quite as detailed, but I don't think it's a waste of two paragraphs to kind of say that. And also spelling out any kind of acronyms. That's a crazy thing that make tenure promotion committees really, really upset because they're like, I don't know what that means. Things like a conference. Maybe you presented at a conference, and that's maybe not like a giant thing for your scholarship, but the reason it's important is because they only take 5% of their submissions. So, like, these are all things that you can put out there. And for the record, if you're not sure on stuff like that, I have never had anyone tell me no. Like if I email conferences and I say, hey, what was the acceptance rate this year? Like the minute I get a conference acceptance in an email, I will immediately email them right back. Great, I'm excited. What's the acceptance rate this year? And sometimes they won't tell you, or they'll say you're not allowed to have the information, but they always respond. And most of the time I get it. And then that email is a piece of evidence that I could use, if I'm trying to say something. So when I applied for full professor at my institution, we have to have 6 peer-reviewed articles, a book, like kind of those kinds of things. But you also have to show a national reputation in the discipline. And so that's a tough thing to do. But one of the things that I could do is I could say, hey, look, I asked about the acceptance rate. I'm only, they only took 5% of the things. And hey, look at this. They asked me if I wanted to do this like special, even though it's peer reviewed, or it's refereed because, we had to have like a committee decide whether I'm going to get in or not. I could say, look, they even asked me to do this other thing. So I also try to think through like, if I had to prove it, how could I prove it? And with scholarship, we think it's really easy. Like, yes, there's a publication, or no, there's not. But there's all those other pieces that go into scholarship, like saying what's important in your field. Because in some fields, conference presentations are a really big deal. Like it's like a public commitment. So I just worked with somebody in nursing that said that, in a lot of ways, like there's this movement in nursing to make conference presentations like very highly ranked, because the idea is that as a nurse, they're supposed to be like sharing this knowledge and all this kind of stuff. So it just, if there's something like that going on in your discipline, it doesn't hurt to just weave it in. Don't spend, 5 paragraphs, just a quick, short paragraph. This is what's going on in my field. Here's how I fit into it. And here's how I've met the criteria for my university or my department. Questions about that with like the scholarship type stuff? All right. Here's a couple things. Let's say that in your performance review, there were some comments about scholarship, like you need to do more, where your scholarship is not robust enough, or it seems like your research agenda is all over the place. There are a lot of ways that you can fix this. If research agenda being all over the place, like it seems like you're jumping from project to project, which is kind of common for new faculty as they're getting stuff figured out. This is a great thing to do in AI if you're an AI person, but you can say, I work in these 3 areas. How are they connected? How would these be connected in scholarship and research? Let it spit it back to you. So, for example, these are 2 random areas that I work in right now, but my secondary area is in classical rhetoric. I teach Aristotle, Plato. I teach a graduate seminar in that. And so that's one of my areas. But then I also have some way back research on like electronic portfolios. Those 2 things don't seem like they go together whatsoever. So I actually did this in a workshop on AI and just kind of showing some things that it can do. But one of the things that it kind of spit back to me, which I thought was really kind of cool, was it talked about the kind of the concept of the portfolio as basically a collection and then a reflection of ideas. And then they talked about like how the concept of reflection is kind of persisted through classical rhetoric. And we wouldn't even have e-portfolios if we didn't have reflection through classical rhetoric. Crazy kind of connection, but could I present it if I had to say, hey, these 2 things, they look like they're not doing the same kind of work, but they're all part of the same bucket. So if you're somebody like that with that fragmented agenda, I would think about doing something like that. You could also look at if you're getting trouble with publications. I don't know how your university treats this, but a lot of us are still sort of in that post-COVID slump, backup, everything else. So in some disciplines, like journals have stopped taking manuscripts for like 2 years because they're publishing the backlog of all the stuff they still have. That is still a thing in 2026. So that could be one thing. If you've got weird like time gaps, COVID is great for, saying that's a thing. Those offices weren't open for 9 months. Of course, some of these things are coming out later. So you can talk about gaps in that way if it's relevant, but also you might think about like just the time it takes to generate an idea or to write, especially in a scholarship statement. Obviously scholarship, it's not just the publication, which of course universities care about. Like they're like, yes, our faculty publish 9 articles a year on average. They want that. But they also want to know, could you do it again? That's the question in that's kind of embedded in that reflective statement. So just like in teaching, how like if you have bad classes over and over and over again, they want to know, do you know what the problem is? And are you trying to fix it? Maybe you haven't fixed it yet. Maybe you tried something and it sort of worked, but you got to tweak it. Scholarship's sort of the same thing. They want to know that you've got active things going, that you could do it again, that you could put something else out. So another thing to think about is if your numbers are kind of borderline or lower, or scholarship just hasn't been a really big priority, it's totally worth taking a little bit of time to talk about how it is a priority now. What are some things that you're doing to get engaged in that? Like part of that might be doing these workshops that Nancy runs. A lot of these are on writing. So I also like to see in narratives, if there is some kind of a problem, is to think about, really understand what the problem is. It could be that you're submitting to these empirical journals, but really your research is more in this other direction. Or your research is too interdisciplinary for this one spot where you've traditionally gone, and you needed a little bit of like on-ramp time to get into this new area. So I would try to get a handle on, if you've got problems with scholarship in a way that you think they're going to be noted as problems, what are you doing to try to fix it? And then also on the high points, I would pick out, like out of your scholarship things, this is a great time again to reflect on publications that you finished. Why are they great? Who wants them? What are they contributing? So, you're kind of making that significance argument over again. So here would be a good example. At the time that I went for full professor, I had done all these interviews with faculty about the writing process. That was the book that I went in to get full professor on. And I know that I knew that that particular committee would not be super friendly to that subject matter, because they would be like, faculty just write. What's the big deal? Like, why would anybody want to know about something like that? So I had to talk about, like, well, here's why it's a problem. Like, actually, only, 11% of faculty on average at any institution are publishing ever. Like, if we just averaged all of us together, it's like 11%. So what happens to everybody else? So you could point out what the problem is too, I think, and that can help. Scholarship questions. What kind of scholarship narrative things that people might be worried about how to frame or
I have a question about
yeah.
that. I've been told that, obviously, well, I would say I'm in the visual arts, so
Oh yeah, creative work.
so
Yep.
yeah, so I've been told that it's good to put down, I guess in my CV, but I was wondering if I should put it down in my narrative too, like how many opportunities I applied for, and obviously I didn't get all of them, but
Mm-hmm.
should that be something of significance to include? Maybe if I was a finalist, I could see me putting it in that there, but I don't
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a tough call. So creative faculty have this a little bit different. So everybody else who's not a creative faculty member, I probably wouldn't put in all the times that you are rejected, for lots of reasons. Just because there's a lot of, I just feel like it's taking up space. It could potentially go the wrong way. For creative faculty, this is what I would do. You are in a different area, and definitely like art, music, performance, like those kind of places, you have to spend some time educating whoever's looking at your stuff, right? Like this is why this exhibit is good, or this is why being able to develop my own theater performance is a good thing, or why it's a mark of good quality. So again, if you can find policies in your discipline area that can help you, great. But in terms of numbers, a finalist, I absolutely would say something about that. Um, here would be another way to think about it. If you've applied to a lot of opportunities, you could mention them. I don't know that you necessarily need a number, but you could just say that these are very competitive. It's really competitive to get into a ceramics show. Like nationally, only 3% of people ever get into them, or whatever it is. So you could say that and then mention, I've applied for those opportunities. While those did not pan out, these are the ones that did. This is how I'm kind of, understanding that that's the area where I'm working. It's really tough, right? So here'd be another example. I just worked with an accounting faculty member who wants to do a textbook in accounting, and their textbook keeps getting turned down. Well, that's because there's hundreds of accounting textbooks, and their textbook's not really unique. So, like in their case, what they ended up doing was they talked about that in their scholarship narrative and said, because textbooks at this university counted as as an artifact, but what they did is they said, look, it took me a while to realize what the flaw in this project was. And so now what I'm doing is in the process of reshaping that accounting textbook manuscript to be an upper level accounting textbook for nonprofits. That's a different thing than like a general accounting textbook when there's hundreds of them out there. So I think the same thing would be true for creative work, where you could say, This is what it took to get that local show or that regional show. That could be a way to do it. Also, for creative faculty, if you're doing more like regional performances, because let's say like in theater, you're probably not putting stuff like on Broadway or something like that, you could talk about the regional location as why that's important. And that's kind of the same with everybody else with regional type scholarship. Sometimes being in the region is where you're supposed to be. That's where you need to be. So if you study, like for me, Midwest literature is a big deal. I'm in Ohio. So, if you're studying Midwest literature, then it's important your work is in the Midwest. So that might not be true, but sometimes you can make that stretch. Like if you're a dance scholar or an art or something, you could say like, this is exhibited regionally, in this area, and this is why it's really important for my work. It may not be like totally how you're thinking about it, but it's a good stretch and it can help make that case if you have a lot of rejections. So I know we are close to the end. There's a ton of things to have in there, but are there other questions people want to ask? I'm going to give a giant folder to Nancy with tons of samples and lots of help for like how do you respond to negative student evaluations, or how can you write a really good teaching philosophy, like all the things that go with this. I have a giant resource folder she is going to get and she can share with you. It's just a Google folder so everybody can look and copy to your heart's content. But any questions before we wrap up for today?
I got another
Yeah.
question. In reference to scholarship, most of my work has always been centered around empowering marginalized communities, but being in
Yep.
Texas,
Oh
there's
yeah.
so,
I'm glad you brought this up because this
yeah.
is I just answered this question earlier today when I did a workshop.
I don't
Yeah.
know how much to divulge or like,
Yeah.
what if I just reframe it in a very kind of generalized way. But yeah.
Okay, this is definitely one you need to ask somebody, and here's what you need to ask. Most review processes for tenure and promotion narratives are private to the institution. And well, let me say this, here's the but for it. Depending on what happens, could somebody get this information? Possibly, if you're already doing the work and you're already out there as a public scholar doing the work, no harm there. I think what you could do, and this is the advice I gave to the other person that was definitely working in those areas. Okay, so she works in Black studies. She does a lot of kind of feminist and food work. And so we were talking about how her university, like she cannot like publicly teach that in her classes. There's nothing like identity related that can be in there. But how she's talking about it in her narrative, because she is up, she's going to talk about it in a way that she's going to maintain the interest in it and work on some projects. So say, yeah, I'm still totally interested in this. This is a need. Like it doesn't matter what's going on politically, like this is still a need, but she is talking about another area of research that she's pursuing that's adjacent but a little more administration friendly. Not a great, we should all be able to do the things we want to do, but I think the way that she's doing it is nice and careful, because one of the things that happens if we go through a review process and they look at your scholarship narrative and they say this person has only done work in this bucket. Well, now this bucket is taboo and nobody likes this bucket anymore. What is this person going to produce for us in the future? Because that's the question, that they want to know is, are you able to do it again? Can you put out a new scholarship thing? So I would definitely present an alternative area you're working on. Even if you haven't published anything in it, doesn't matter. But just an idea that, I'm shifting my research direction to whatever it is, because that's a sign of reassurance that you're going to be able to put out the goods post review. It's not a great answer, but I think it's a safe answer. Other stuff that people want to ask? Yeah. I have some samples, and Nancy, in your big old folder, which you will get, I have some of those kind of creative reframes, like just models of language about how to do that, because it's delicate, right? Also, this is one that I did not put in there, but I definitely will. If you have ever had to take a leave of absence, maternity leave, COVID, long COVID, whatever, sometimes you'll have a big scholarship dip in there that's really noticeable, like 3 years without anything or something like that. I do have those reframes, to kind of use that language to talk about what you were up to. And of course, you can blame like slow publication cycles and all that. But, if you were out for some specific reason, there is a way to kind of do that. And that's also with teaching too, because that can mean like sometimes your teaching evaluations are really, really poor because it's your first semester back teaching and you have a newborn at home for the semester. So I don't like to overdo the human element with this because they have to make decisions based on evidence and we have to think about your readers. They got to make the call that they got to make. But I do think it's important to just provide like the teensy ounce of context if you can. So I've got some samples about how to do that like carefully and kind of in a small way. So you're dropping those in.